A very famous sociologist, his name is C. Wright Mills, he's in your book, you'll see his name, introduced the concept of what we call a sociological imagination. And that is essentially the habit and the skill, and it is a skill, it requires practice, to be able to see the world and an individual's life, whether your own or someone else's, sociologically. And in some ways, that's sort of a way of saying, especially in Western cultures, so in sort of North America and in Europe, there is a tendency to see individual lives as the result of individual choices, right? We see sort of someone's outcome, someone's profession, someone's sort of choice in romantic partner. We see all of those things as a result of their individual choices. And I'm not going to deny that idea about agency, and that people do have choices, but sociology in a lot of ways is really about sort of identifying the ways that choice and that perception of choice is constructed socially, the way that the world around us kind of shapes that. So when we talk about, for example, homelessness is a really sort of easy example to talk about. In a lot of society, we will talk about homelessness as a series of choices that people made. Choices not to finish high school, choices to do drugs, choices to do any number of those things. And those are choices, but a sociological imagination would sort of step back and say, hey, wait a second. Yeah, those are choices, but what choices do you have around finishing high school when your family is so impoverished, for example, that you're expected to work to be able to pay the rent and put food on the table? Like, that is a constraint on your choice. And does it make sense to finish high school if you're convinced, for whatever reason, that you're not going to ever be able to go to university, right? Does that sort of change your ideas? Does the decision to do drugs change if you've experienced so much trauma that substances are one of the ways that you're able to cope with the world? So a sociological imagination is kind of about that piece, about that idea about how do we see individual experiences and lives as being connected to sort of broader pieces. You'll see that sort of in functionalism and conflict, where the idea is top down. Elsewhere, there's some conversations about how individual choices and experiences actually create the social structures that wind up affecting people. So there's a conversation there about we create our tools and thereafter our tools shape us, right? Some reciprocal relationships there. One of the sort of pieces, there's sort of two statements that are associated with that sort of introduction to a sociological imagination. And one of them is about seeing the strange and the familiar. So there's a lot of things in our world that we take for granted, lots of things that happen in our day-to-day lives that we take for granted, and we sort of treat them as natural, as if that is the way that the world works. And seeing the strange in the familiar is a way of sort of understanding that those choices and those experiences and those elements are not necessarily natural. They're the result of a bunch of choices. So there's a sort of great discussion about how the width of the roads and the lanes on our roads right now is actually related to how wide a horse's backside is, because we built roads initially based on Roman chariots, and then when we built rail cars, we built them on the same width so that they, like when we built like cars, we built them on the same width so they could use the same roads. And that means that like this idea that we take for granted about like how wide is a 3-lane street, for example, 4-lane street, is actually based on something that doesn't have anything to do with what we're looking at now. And I think maybe a way to put it is to say that when we talk about social structures sociologically, the idea of seeing the strange and the familiar is deeply connected to sort of an idea that's always in the back of your mind about it could be another way. that this is not the only way to organize family or schooling or romantic partnerships or any of that sort of stuff, that there's always another way. And so we kind of have to look at the ones that we have, right? The ones that sort of are in front of us and go, how did it get to be that way? And to sort of ask those questions about things that we often take for granted. And that's sort of an idea about seeing the strange and the familiar. And then there's also sort of a conversation about seeing the general in the particular. And that is a way of saying that these individual events, okay, are actually connected to broader social patterns. So if we talk about something like the responses to sort of stay-at-home orders and COVID pandemics, yes, people are making individual choices in that. But if you look at people's individual choices, what you wind up seeing is examples of broader social patterns. So there are conversations there about ideas of social responsibility. How much responsibility do you think you have to other people? And that plays out in sort of individual level responses. How much do you trust the government, and how is that related to sort of your position in society? That plays out in those individual interactions, right? So one of the ideas there is that you can look at what's happening in an individual case and you can sort of say, oh, okay, that can sort of connect to this broader pattern and this broader pattern and this broader pattern. And you can sort of use those individual level experiences to look out. That is much easier, I think, for me to describe than for students to sort of understand, and a large part of that is because I've been doing this for many years. So if you're struggling with that, don't stress too much about it. Feel free to ask questions. The only other thing I sort of wanted to put in this video in particular is the idea that we can use sociology in a variety of different contexts. So this is the very end of your chapter, and the sociological imagination is very much at the beginning. I just like them organized this way. It's not really anything particularly special about that. But we have 4 types of sociology and sort of 4 areas, I guess, that we direct sociology and sociological understandings at. So the one that is practiced in most university classrooms is what we call academic sociology. And this is really just sociology in a bid to understand. This is sort of where we get research studies. This is where we get sociologists who talk mainly to other sociologists and to students to sort of teach these like formalized. This is where we get a lot of the sort of complicated terminology. You get discourses, you get all of this vocabulary that you're learning over the course of this semester. That's academic sociology. The other way we can sort of talk about sociology to understand is the idea of private sociology, and that will ask you, there's a bunch of questions in our discussion forums that are asking you to do this, but that's taking sort of sociological concepts and applying them to your own life, to sort of talk about, okay, how does my class position affect my life? How does my gender affect my life? And to sort of understand your own life through those lenses. Okay, so that's private sociology. And then we have sort of 2 other pieces. We have sort of policy sociology and public sociology. Policy sociology, as you might guess from the name, is directed at sort of informing policy. So a really great example of sort of the use of policy sociology is conversations around safe injection sites. So it was policy sociologists, with many others, of course, who started talking about safe consumption sites for illicit substances that are not actually allowed in our society, but we're going to create places where people can use them under supervision is actually beneficial to society. And their sort of argument in that sort of realm of policy sociology comes from things like, okay, so here's the conversation we have. It costs us X amount to deal with drug addiction, but it also costs us this other amount to deal with the consequences of hepatitis from people reusing needles. So if we allow people to consume illicit substances, if people are still consuming drugs, but they are doing so in an environment where they don't also have contaminated needles, we're still dealing with the drug addiction, but we're reducing the costs that we're dealing with for hepatitis, right? They're also talking about things like, oh, and by the way, if you have a safe place where people can go to consume those substances, they also have a place to access supports to stop using those substances. That kind of argument and that kind of analysis about what brings people to different places and how you create policy rules around that is that sort of realm of policy sociology. Public sociology is a little bit different. And public sociology kind of strips away a lot of the jargon and the vocabulary of academic sociology, because it's really about getting people, not the people who make policy, but like everyday people, to understand sociological concepts and sociological ideas around that. And an example of what sort of public sociology might look like might include, for example, parenting programs that aim to educate parents about the consequences and what happens if you use corporal punishment if you spank your children, and why you might not want to do that. There's a lot of like very sort of academic terminology that you can use to talk about those issues. But when we do public sociology, we're sort of trying to strip all of that away and talk to people in ways that make sense to them to allow them to change behavior. So when we talked about sort of academic and private sociology is really about understanding. Public sociology and policy sociology are kind of definitionally about trying to change things about society, about an analysis of understanding what's working, what's not working, and how we might sort of build from that. We can talk about private sociology being used for change too, but that's really a choice up to the individual in terms of, are we using this analysis to decide we want to change or not? Okay. So, very brief videos introducing our first module in Sociology 100. Have a great week, everyone.